The night was cruel, the wind slicing through the dark like a blade. A luxury SUV stopped on a desolate road. A door opened. A shivering German shepherd, her belly swollen with life, stepped out. The tires screeched. Then silence. She was alone. The wind howled through the empty stretch of road, carrying with it the scent of ice and loneliness. The towering pines stood as silent witnesses, their branches heavy with snow, bending under the weight of winter's cruel grip. In the distance, headlights cut through the darkness like cold, unfeeling eyes. A sleek black SUV came to a slow, deliberate stop. Inside, a man in an expensive wool coat tightened his grip on the leather steering wheel. His fingers, adorned with rings that gleamed under the dim interior light, twitched slightly. He exhaled, his breath clouding in the chill. It was supposed to be easy. Just open the door, let her out, and drive away. The German shepherd beside him shifted, sensing something was wrong. Her round belly, swollen with the weight of unborn life, heaved with each anxious breath. She had known the warmth of this car, the scent of the man's cologne, the feeling of a strong hand ruffling her fur on better days. But tonight, the warmth had vanished. The man, the one she trusted, was different. Cold. Distant. His phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen. "Handle it quickly. You know I can't have that mess in the house." His wife's words. Sharp. Final. He swallowed hard. His world was built on pristine surfaces, on control, on perfection. A dog about to give birth in the middle of their marble-floored estate? Unacceptable. His wife had made that clear. Slowly, mechanically, he reached for the door handle. It clicked open. The German shepherd's ears perked up. She hesitated, peering up at him with trusting amber eyes, waiting for a command, a gesture, anything. But instead, the man turned away. His gaze locked on the darkness ahead, refusing to meet hers. Then, without warning, he pushed her out. She stumbled onto the frozen ground, her paws slipping on the icy asphalt. The cold bit into her immediately, sending a shock through her frail body. She turned back to him, ears drooping, tail low. Her breath puffed in frantic clouds as she pawed at the door. A plea. A whimper. The man hesitated for half a second. Then the door slammed shut. The SUV roared to life. The red glow of taillights painted the snow in eerie shades of crimson as the vehicle sped off, kicking up a flurry of ice and dust. And just like that, she was alone. The cold pressed against her, wrapping around her body like a merciless grip. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, a lifeless void offering no shelter, no warmth, only the indifferent silence of a world that had turned its back on her. Her swollen belly tightened with a sharp pain. A storm was coming, and so were her puppies. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere at all. The world had never felt this vast. The wind ripped through the trees, howling like a pack of wolves, its icy fingers clawing at her fur. She stumbled forward, each step a struggle against exhaustion. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts, every exhale forming a fragile cloud in the freezing night. The snow swallowed her paws with each step. It numbed her limbs, sapping what little strength she had left. The puppies inside her shifted, an ache rolling through her belly like the slow turn of a tide. She needed to find shelter. Her nose twitched, searching for something, anything, that smelled of warmth, of safety. But all she could smell was the sharp bite of frost, the damp scent of bark, the emptiness of a world too cruel to care. She let out a low, mournful whimper. No one answered. She had never been alone before. Once she had been part of something, a home, a life. The man who had just abandoned her. He wasn't always like this. She remembered when his hands were gentle, when his voice was warm. She had slept at his feet as he worked in his office, feeling safe in the soft glow of the fireplace. But then things had changed. The woman had come. A scent of expensive perfume. Sharp heels clacking on marble floors. Cold, narrowed eyes that had never once looked at her with kindness. The woman never wanted her there. She had tried to stay out of the way, curling up in the corners, making herself small. But it wasn't enough. And now she was here, alone. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed into the snow, the weight of her unborn puppies pressing heavily against her ribs. The pain came in waves now, sharp and relentless. She needed warmth. She needed help. A flicker of movement in the distance caught her eye. A dim light, barely visible through the trees. A cabin. Her ears perked slightly. Hope flickered like a dying flame. With the last of her strength, she forced herself forward, one trembling step at a time, dragging her weary body toward salvation. She didn't know if she would make it, but she had no choice. Because life, tiny, fragile life, was depending on her. Snow clung to her fur in heavy clumps, each step through the drifts stealing what little heat remained in her body. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision swimming with exhaustion. The pain in her belly twisted sharper now, relentless and unyielding. The puppies were coming. She had no time. The dim glow ahead flickered through the trees, a fragile beacon of hope. A cabin. She had never seen it before, but instinct told her it was the only chance she had. Her legs trembled as she pushed forward, her paws raw from the ice. Each step was agony, but the thought of her unborn puppies kept her moving. The wind howled through the branches, rattling them like bones. In the distance, a wolf's mournful cry echoed through the night. Her heart pounded. She wasn't alone out here. Predators lurked in the darkness. She quickened her pace. The cabin was small, its wooden frame aged and sturdy against the relentless winter. Smoke curled from the chimney, warmth, safety, life. She reached the porch, collapsing against the wooden steps. The world tilted, pain rolling through her like a wave. She let out a weak whimper, barely more than a whisper in the wind. Would they hear her? Would they care? Inside the cabin, a man sat hunched over a flickering lantern. His hands, rough and weathered, gripped a worn mug of coffee. His name was Daniel, a man who had once known the warmth of family, but had long since lost it. The nights out here were lonely, the silence unbearable. Then he heard it. A sound so soft he almost mistook it for the wind. A whimper, his brow furrowed. He set the mug down, pushing himself up from the old rocking chair. Moving to the door, he hesitated for only a moment before pulling it open. The wind lashed at his face, biting at the exposed skin. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the snow. Then he saw her, a heap of fur and exhaustion, barely clinging to life. Her sides heaved with shallow breaths, her paws curled against the cold wood of the steps. And her belly. Daniel's breath hitched. She was pregnant. "Dear God," he murmured, stepping closer. The dog lifted her head weakly, amber eyes meeting his. Something inside him cracked. Years of solitude, of regret, of shutting the world out. It all crumbled in an instant. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, slipping his arms under her trembling body. She let out a soft, pained sigh, too weak to resist. "You're okay now," he whispered. "I've got you." The snow swirled around them as he carried her inside, closing the door behind him. She was safe. For now. The heat inside the cabin was a shock to her frozen body. She whimpered softly as the warmth seeped into her bones, thawing what the cold had nearly stolen from her. Daniel laid her down on an old quilt near the fireplace, his hands gentle despite their roughness. He had never been the kind of man to turn away a soul in need. He wasn't about to start now. "Easy, girl," he murmured, brushing snow from her fur. His fingers skimmed over her ribs, too thin, too fragile. How long had she been out there? She let out a deep, exhausted sigh, her body finally surrendering to the warmth. Then the first contraction hit. Her body tensed, her breath hitching in pain. Daniel's heart pounded. All right," he said, more to himself than to her. He had delivered calves before, but never puppies. He moved quickly, grabbing clean towels, warming water on the stove. The old vet's book he had tucked away years ago suddenly felt like the most important thing in the world. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, life fought to be born. The first puppy arrived minutes later, slick and fragile, its tiny chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. Daniel worked quickly, rubbing the pup with a towel, clearing its airway. A tiny cry filled the cabin. He placed the newborn beside its mother. She turned her head weakly, licking the pup with trembling devotion. Another contraction, then another. One by one, the puppies came, each one bringing a flicker of hope into the cold night. Daniel barely noticed the ache in his knees from kneeling on the wooden floor. All that mattered was them. When the last pup was born, the mother let out a heavy, shuddering breath. Exhausted but relieved, she curled protectively around her litter, her body instinctively shielding them. Daniel sat back, running a hand through his graying hair. He exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. He had spent years believing he had nothing left to give. But here, in this tiny cabin, with a mother and her newborn safe and warm, he realized maybe he had been wrong. Maybe there was still something worth saving. Maybe there was still hope. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light over the tiny family curled together on the quilt. The mother nudged her puppies gently, ensuring each one was warm, safe, and fed. Daniel sat beside them, a quiet observer. The loneliness that had gripped him for so long felt lighter now, as if the weight of his past had been momentarily lifted by the simple act of kindness. He thought about the man who had abandoned her, the kind of person who could look into those trusting eyes and still choose to leave. His jaw clenched. Cowards. He reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers over the mother's head. She flicked an ear but didn't move away. Her trust was fragile, but it was there. "You need a name," he mused softly, watching as one of the puppies let out a tiny yawn. A memory stirred. Years ago, before his world had collapsed, before he had lost the woman he loved, there had been another dog, a golden retriever named Maggie. His wife had named her. It had been years since he had said the name aloud, but as he looked down at the exhausted but resilient German shepherd, it felt right. "Maggie," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched slightly. Daniel smiled. A knock at the door startled them both. Who the hell could that be? He pushed himself to his feet, wary. Visitors were rare in these parts, especially in the dead of winter. He opened the door cautiously, cold air rushing in. A man stood on the porch, his expensive coat dusted with snow, and Daniel recognized him instantly. The millionaire, the one who had abandoned her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice laced with hesitation, the man said, "I think I made a mistake." Daniel's grip on the door tightened. Behind him, the mother dog curled tighter around her puppies, as if sensing the danger that had returned. Daniel exhaled slowly. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You did exactly what you meant to do." He started to close the door. The millionaire took a step forward, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Please." The door clicked shut. Inside, the fire burned warm. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he had done something truly right. Maggie and her pups would never be abandoned again. Not as long as he was breathing. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows as the millionaire stood on the porch, shifting uncomfortably. Snowflakes clung to his dark coat, his polished shoes already dusted with ice. His breath formed quick, uneasy clouds in the cold air. Daniel didn't move. He stood firm, his hand still gripping the edge of the door. Behind him, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Maggie let out a quiet whimper from the warmth of the hearth, her protective body curled around her newborns. The millionaire cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet Daniel's gaze. I need to talk to you," he said, voice stiff, unnatural, as if unused to humility. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had seen men like this before, the kind who believed their money could fix anything, who only felt remorse when their actions threatened to stain their reputation. He didn't answer. "I know what I did," the man continued, shifting from foot to foot, as if the weight of guilt made him restless. I was under pressure. I wasn't thinking." Daniel let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "You weren't thinking?" His voice was low, laced with restrained anger. "You mean when you drove her out in the middle of a storm? When you left her to freeze with pups inside her? Which part of that wasn't thinking?" The millionaire swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I didn't know she was pregnant," Daniel scoffed. "That's supposed to make it better?" The man ran a hand over his face, sighing. "Look, I came back, didn't I?" He gestured helplessly toward the snow-covered road. "I regretted it. I shouldn't have done it. And now I just want to make it right." Daniel eyed him carefully. His gut twisted with distrust. He had spent enough years reading people to know when someone was only half telling the truth. "So what do you want?" Daniel asked flatly. "You came all this way in a snowstorm. Why?" The man hesitated, glancing past Daniel, toward the warmth of the fire, the flicker of movement where Maggie lay. "I want her back," he said. Silence. The words sank in like a slow, creeping poison. Daniel's fingers curled into a fist. Maggie let out a low, warning growl. The millionaire lifted his hands. "Look, I know how it sounds, all right? But she was my dog. I raised her. I took care of her before all this. And I panicked, okay? My wife, she gave me an ultimatum. It was either her or the dog." His voice cracked slightly, as if saying it aloud made him realize how pathetic it sounded. Daniel exhaled, a slow, measured breath through his nose. His blood burned with barely contained fury. "You don't get to do that," he said quietly. "You don't get to throw something away and then come crawling back when you feel guilty." The millionaire's lips parted, but no words came. He looked down, as if for the first time, shame was beginning to settle deep in his bones. Daniel could see it, the internal war raging behind his eyes. But guilt wasn't enough, not now, not after what he had done. "You should go," Daniel said finally, stepping back and beginning to close the door. The man lurched forward. "Wait, please, let me see her, just once. His voice was strained, desperate. "I just need to know she's okay." Daniel hesitated. Not because he felt sorry for the man, no, not in the slightest, but because Maggie deserved a choice. He glanced over his shoulder at her. The German shepherd lifted her head slightly, amber eyes locking onto the man standing in the cold. Her ears flattened, her body tensed. The puppies stirred beneath her, but she didn't move to greet him. Didn't wag her tail, didn't whimper in recognition. She just stared. The man swallowed, waiting, expecting something, but Maggie's expression never changed. Daniel turned back to him. "She's already made her choice," he said simply. Then he shut the door. The millionaire was gone. Daniel had watched from the window as the expensive car disappeared down the snowy road, the red taillights swallowed by the night. But the anger still burned in his chest. He had lived a long life. Long enough to know that people like that man didn't just disappear. Guilt would gnaw at him. Or worse, pride would push him to prove that Maggie was still his. Daniel didn't trust it. Didn't trust him. Maggie must have felt it too. She hadn't relaxed since the knock on the door, her ears flicking toward every sound, her body curled more tightly around her newborns. He crouched beside her, running a hand gently over her head. "Don't worry, girl," he murmured. "You're safe here." She blinked at him slowly, as if trying to believe it, as if trying to believe in him. The days passed, and Maggie began to heal. Her strength returned, her ribs no longer jutting out beneath her fur. Her puppies grew stronger too, their tiny whimpers filling the cabin with life. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something that had been absent for so long. Purpose. Each morning he would check on them, making sure they were warm, well-fed. Maggie trusted him now, allowed him to touch her pups, to be near them without worry. She was still cautious, still protective. But she knew he meant no harm. She knew she wasn't alone. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, Daniel heard it. A car engine, slow, deliberate, coming up the road. His chest tightened. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping to the window. His stomach turned to stone. It was him. The millionaire's car rolled to a stop just beyond the porch. Daniel's teeth clenched. He grabbed his coat, stepping outside before the man had a chance to knock. The cold bit into his skin, but his anger burned hotter. The millionaire looked up from where he stood, rubbing his hands together. His expression was different this time. Not desperate, calculated. "I thought I told you to leave," Daniel said. His voice was calm, dangerous. The man exhaled through his nose. "I came to make you an offer." Daniel's stomach churned. "I'm not selling her." The man gave a tight smile. "I figured you'd say that." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick, neatly stacked envelope. "I'm willing to pay for her," he said, extending it forward. "Enough for you to take care of yourself. You don't have to struggle out here. Take the money. Let me have her back." Daniel didn't look at the envelope. Didn't need to. His answer was already set in stone. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, voice low. "She's not a thing. She's not a purchase. You don't own her anymore." The man's jaw ticked. "I could take you to court for this." Daniel smiled, slow and knowing. "Go ahead. Try explaining to a judge how you abandoned a pregnant dog in the freezing cold." The man's face darkened. For the first time, Daniel saw it, the crack in his confidence. He had nothing left to bargain with. Daniel took a step closer, his voice steady. "You left her to die, and now you have to live with that." The man swallowed, his fingers tightening around the envelope. Then slowly, he stepped back, got in his car, drove away. Daniel didn't move until the sound of the engine had long faded into silence. Then, and only then, did he let himself breathe. Inside, Maggie lay curled around her puppies, peaceful, warm, safe. Daniel knelt beside her, rubbing her ear with the gentlest touch. "You're never going back to him," he whispered. And she never would. Not as long as he was alive. The storm had passed, but the weight in Daniel's chest remained. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Outside, the wind had stilled, leaving only the quiet hush of snow settling in thick drifts against the cabin. The world was silent. Too silent. Maggie lay curled near the fireplace, her body wrapped around her puppies, their tiny breaths rising and falling in rhythm. Every so often she would lift her head, ears twitching toward the door, as if listening for a sound only she could hear. Daniel understood. He had spent years listening for ghosts himself. He sat in his worn armchair, staring at the darkened window. His reflection stared back, older, heavier with the burden of memories. A man who had lived a life of mistakes, of loss, of things he wished he could take back. And now, another mistake had come to his doorstep. The millionaire would return. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow. But men like him didn't let go easily. Daniel could still see the way his eyes had darkened at the rejection, the tight grip on the envelope, the twitch in his jaw when Daniel told him the truth he didn't want to hear. "You left her to die, and now you have to live with that." Would guilt be enough to keep him away, or would pride bring him back? Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. The familiar bitter ache of regret twisted in his gut. For years, he had lived alone in this cabin, surrounded by silence. He had told himself it was what he deserved. That isolation was easier than facing the weight of his own past. But Maggie, she had changed something. For the first time in years, There was something in this house worth protecting. Not just an old man and his regrets. Life. Tiny, fragile, new life. He pushed himself up from the chair, his knees creaking in protest. Moving to the window, he pulled back the curtain just slightly, peering out into the night. The road was empty, covered in fresh snow. No tracks, no headlights. But he knew better than to trust the quiet. Daniel wasn't a fool. He moved through the cabin with purpose, checking the locks, reinforcing the door with an old wooden bar. He wasn't a paranoid man by nature, but instinct told him this wasn't over. Maggie lifted her head as he passed by, her eyes tracking him, alert and knowing. She had been abandoned once before. She understood what it meant to be hunted. "Don't worry, girl," Daniel murmured, crouching beside her. He rubbed behind her ears, feeling the warmth of her body beneath his fingertips. "I won't let him take you." She blinked at him slowly. Trust. That was the thing about dogs. They didn't care about past mistakes. They didn't hold grudges, didn't question whether you were good or bad. They just knew the truth of a person's heart. Daniel had spent years believing his was beyond saving. Maggie didn't seem to agree. He sighed, leaning back against the old wooden floor. The fire's warmth seeped into his bones, soothing the ache in his muscles. The puppies stirred, soft little whimpers breaking the stillness. Maggie nudged them closer, her tongue brushing over their tiny heads in silent reassurance. Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't pray much anymore, hadn't in years. But tonight, with the weight of the past pressing heavy on his chest, he let himself whisper a silent plea into the darkness. Not for himself, for them. For Maggie. For the puppies who had no idea the kind of world they had been born into. For the hope that, for once, doing the right thing wouldn't come with a cost too heavy to bear. The fire crackled softly. The wind howled once more. And Daniel waited, knowing that the real fight was still ahead. The storm had faded, leaving behind a world cloaked in thick white silence. The morning sun bled through the frost-covered trees, casting long golden beams across the snow. It was a picture of serenity. But Daniel's gut told him the peace wouldn't last. He had barely slept. Every creak of the old wooden cabin had set his nerves on edge. His mind had raced through every possibility, every way the millionaire might try to come back for Maggie. He had seen men like that before, the kind who believed that money could erase their sins, that ownership was something they could buy back with regret and a fat envelope of cash. But Maggie wasn't for sale. And Daniel wasn't about to let a coward rewrite the past just because guilt had started eating him alive. The German shepherd stretched beside the fireplace, her body curled protectively around her puppies. She was stronger now, her ribs no longer protruding as they had when she first arrived. Her coat had regained its luster, and though her eyes still held shadows of fear, there was trust now too. Daniel moved quietly through the cabin, checking the door, the windows, reinforcing what he could. The old hunting rifle that had sat untouched for years now rested by the door. He didn't want trouble, but if trouble came, he'd be ready. Then he heard it. The low hum of an engine. His breath hitched. Slowly he stepped toward the window, peering out between the wooden slats of the curtain. A black luxury SUV idled at the bottom of the driveway, just beyond the snow-covered path that led to the porch. It was him. Daniel clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the curtain. The driver's door opened. The millionaire stepped out, his coat buttoned up to his neck, his polished boots crunching against the snow as he moved forward. Daniel pushed the door open before he could get any closer, stepping onto the porch with slow, deliberate movements. His breath fogged in the cold air. The man stopped a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. "Morning," he said, as if they were two neighbors exchanging pleasantries over a fence. Daniel didn't respond. He simply stared, waiting. The millionaire sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I get it. You don't like me. Hell, I don't even like me. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. But I didn't come here to fight. Daniel crossed his arms. Then why are you here? The man hesitated. I just need to see her. One last time. His voice was quieter now, as if the cold had stolen the sharp edges from it. That's all. Then I'll go. Daniel studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. He didn't trust him. But maybe, just maybe, Maggie deserved the chance to make her own choice. Daniel stepped aside. Fine, he said. But if she doesn't want anything to do with you, you walk away. For good. The millionaire nodded. Fair enough. Daniel whistled softly, a quiet call. Inside, Maggie lifted her head. Her ears perked, her amber eyes flicking toward the door. She hesitated, sniffing the air. Then she rose. She moved slowly at first, her steps cautious as she padded toward the open doorway. The cold air rushed in around her, stirring her fur as she stepped onto the porch. She saw him. The man took a slow step forward. Hey girl, he murmured. Maggie stopped. Her tail didn't wag. She didn't whimper in recognition. She just stood there, watching him. The millionaire swallowed. His breath came in slow, uneven puffs. His hands twitched at his sides. I messed up, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I know that. I shouldn't have left you. I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong. Maggie didn't move. She didn't turn away, but she didn't go to him either. Daniel waited, saying nothing. The millionaire crouched down, extending a hand toward her. Please, he whispered. I just need to know if you can forgive me. Maggie's ears twitched. For a moment, she seemed to consider. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stepped back. The millionaire's breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists. Maggie lowered her head, her body shifting slightly, positioning herself between him and the doorway, where her puppies still lay sleeping inside. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She had simply made her choice. And it wasn't him. The man let out a shaky breath. His eyes glistened. Then, finally, he nodded. All right, he murmured. I understand. He pushed himself to his feet, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally settled. I won't come back, he said. I swear. Daniel nodded. The millionaire hesitated for a second longer, his gaze lingering on Maggie one last time. Then he turned. He walked back to his car. The engine roared to life. And then, just as quickly as he had come, he was gone. Maggie watched until the taillights disappeared down the road. Then she let out a soft breath, turned back toward Daniel, and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was warm, filled with the quiet sounds of crackling firewood and the gentle breaths of sleeping puppies. Maggie curled up beside them, her body relaxed in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. She was home now, and she knew it. Daniel exhaled, leaning against the wooden door. The weight in his chest had shifted. Lighter now, like something had finally settled in its rightful place. For years he had believed that some wounds never healed, that once you lost something, you couldn't get it back. But maybe, just maybe, Maggie had proved him wrong. He walked over to where she lay, crouching beside her. He ran a hand gently over her fur. You did good, girl, he murmured. She blinked up at him, content. Daniel let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. Guess that means I need to start thinking of names for these little guys, huh? Maggie huffed softly in response, resting her head against his knee. Daniel smiled. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of quiet. The past was behind them now, buried beneath the cold. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel alone. He had Maggie. He had the puppies. And for the first time in years, he had hope. The days passed, and the cabin became a sanctuary of warmth and quiet life. The storm had long since lifted, leaving behind a world draped in soft, unbroken white. The trees sagged under the weight of snow, the sky a crisp winter blue. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. The scent of pine and warmth filled the air. Maggie lay curled near the hearth, her body wrapped protectively around her growing puppies. They no longer whimpered with frailty. They yawned, stretched, and clumsily tumbled over each other, their tiny tails wagging. Daniel sat in his old chair, watching them with quiet amusement. He had never imagined this kind of life for himself. For so long, he had convinced himself that his world was meant to stay small, that he was meant to live out his years in solitude, cut off from the noise and weight of the past. But now, the cabin felt full of life, full of warmth, full of something he had been missing for far too long. Maggie lifted her head, watching him as if sensing the shift in his thoughts. Daniel chuckled. "What?" he murmured. "You checking up on me?" She blinked, her ears twitching. Daniel sighed, leaning back. "You and your little ones turned this place upside down, you know that?" Maggie huffed in response, resting her head against her paws, her tail flicking lightly against the floor. Daniel shook his head, looking down at the bundle of puppies nestled close to her. "I guess we need to figure out what we're going to do with all of you." That had been a thought lingering in the back of his mind for days. There were 6 of them. 6 tiny, squirming bodies, growing stronger by the day. They wouldn't stay small forever. The idea of giving them away left a strange, twisting feeling in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of any of them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Daniel stiffened, his body tensing on instinct. Maggie's ears perked. She didn't growl this time. She simply watched. He pushed himself up, moving toward the door cautiously. When he opened it, the cold air rushed in, biting at his skin. A woman stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, a knit hat pulled low over her ears. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hands stuffed into her pockets. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah?" The woman exhaled in relief. "My name's Claire. I work at the vet clinic in town. The sheriff told me about the dog you took in." Daniel's stomach tightened slightly. He didn't like that word spreading. He had no intention of letting anyone come here thinking they could take her away. Claire must have seen the tension in his posture because she quickly lifted her hands. "I'm not here to take her," she said. I wanted to make sure she's okay, and I thought maybe I could help." Daniel hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." She smiled faintly, stepping inside. The warmth of the cabin seemed to surprise her, her fingers twitching as she pulled off her gloves. And then she saw Maggie. Her eyes softened instantly. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. Maggie watched her carefully, but her tail flicked once in quiet acknowledgement. Claire turned back to Daniel, her voice quieter. "She looks good, strong. She's got a beautiful litter." Daniel crossed his arms. "She's safe here. That's all that matters." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I can tell you care about her." Daniel didn't respond. She hesitated. "I know what happened. About the man who left her." Daniel's jaw clenched. It's not his story anymore. Claire smiled. "No," she agreed. "It's yours now." She crouched near the puppies, careful not to reach for them, just watching. "They're gonna need checkups soon. Vaccines, proper food." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I know." "I can help with that," she said simply. "No charge, just because it's the right thing to do." Daniel studied her carefully. He wasn't used to people offering kindness without expecting something in return. Finally, he nodded. "All right," Claire smiled, pushing herself up. "I'll come by in a few days. Bring supplies. Check on them." She moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back at him. You did a good thing, Daniel, taking her in. Daniel glanced at Maggie, who had settled again, her breathing slow and steady. Yeah, he murmured. I think she took me in. Claire chuckled. Sounds about right. And then she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the cold once more. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maggie watched him, her amber eyes steady. He smirked. Guess you've got a vet now. She let out a soft huff, curling tighter around her pups. Daniel sat back down, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. The world outside was still cold, still harsh, but in here, life was just beginning. And for the first time in a long, long time, Daniel was ready for it. Some choices can never be undone. But sometimes, second chances don't come from the people who failed us. They come from those who choose to love us anyway. Maggie was abandoned, left to freeze, but she found a new home, a new family, and a life worth living. How many stories like hers go untold? How many second chances are waiting just beyond the cold? If this story moved you, consider supporting local shelters, adopting, or simply spreading awareness. Every life matters. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us. Kindness changes everything.